I'm Haas. Welcome. Today, the point of this talk is how to be a contributor. If if you're sort of interested in getting started with Solr, if you're not that familiar with Solr, if you've never really contributed to Solr and you don't really even know what that means, this talk is hopefully for you. If you are a hardcore Java developer and you're hoping we're going to talk about a lot of internals and how the Solr code works, this is not the right talk for you guys. This is very entry level. If you want to get hardcore and technical, I think Varun's talks next door is probably a better bet for you guys. I'm putting that out there before we get started. Anyway, yes, my name is Haas, and I should have left it on this slide first. How to be a Solr contributor. Who I am. I'm a software developer. I work at Lucidworks. I've been around for a while. I've been working on Solr for a while. And our agenda today is really, like I said, getting started. The entry level, like what does it mean to be a contributor? How do you get started as a contributor, even if you're not very technical or you don't feel like you're very technical? This is not a technical talk, but we are going to talk about, how to get started, how to involve yourself, and how to grow and think like a committer and just become more productive and contribute more. So I want to open with this quote, Andy Lester, who's Andy's this guy that, he's been around a long time, and when I was learning how to write software, 20-some years ago, Andy was very prolific in Usenet, and I'm guessing like 5 people in this room know what I'm talking about. But, when I was learning how to write software and I was learning how to write Perl code, he was prolific. He was a huge mentor, very helpful, really taught me a lot about, getting started and how to grow. And then, 15-some years later, he showed up in the Solr IRC chat room like, how does this work? Like, I don't understand what I'm doing here. And I was able to help him, right? Because we had different skill sets, and at different times of our lives, we had different skill sets, and we knew different things. And there were contributions he could make to me and to help me grow, and there were contributions I could make to him to help him grow. But he's also a very smart guy when it comes to open source. This comes from a blog post he did a while back. Everybody has something. As a user, without knowing anything about the code underneath, just using it as an application, you still have experience with the software, and your participation in the community can help that community grow, can help the people who are writing the software understand how the community uses it. So everybody has something that they can contribute. As far as why you should contribute, hopefully if you're in this room, you sort of see some value in contributing. That doesn't necessarily mean your boss sees value in contributing. This is a question I get a lot. Is like, yeah, I really want to dive in, but like, how do I convince my boss? And then, as I was writing these slides like a month ago, I saw this news article. This guy Frank Nagel he's apparently a researcher at Harvard Business School who studies business, which is a thing, I guess. And he did a very involved formal study on companies and employees contributing to open source, and found that companies who let their employees contribute to open source do better. And the sort of takeaway of this thesis is that the more involved you get in an open source project and the more involved you get in contributing to the open source project, the better you and your employees understand the open source project, understand what it's capable of, understand what it can do, understand how to use it effectively, and that actually has benefits on ROI. So these slides, oh, and I forgot to mention this, don't take notes or anything. This URL will be up on the screen again. All this is online, and it has copious notes, including links to all this stuff. So you can go find that link, and the next time you're like, hey man, I really want to work. Can I get like 20% time to like just work on Solr? And they're like, what? No, fuck you. I'm not gonna let you do that. You can be like, no. Look, here's this pub site like citation. It's valuable. Like this will make us money. Okay, so how do you get started, right? Even if you don't know Java, even if you don't know where to begin, the community is really the entry point to contributions, right? Participation in the community is really the first and foremost best way to contribute to the community, to get started with your sort of contribution process. You're growing as a contributor. When I talk about community, you're already step one. You're here. You're at a conference. You're meeting other people who are using Solr. You're talking to other people who are using Solr. You're talking to other people about how they use Solr. But the mailing list, Stack Overflow, what else do I got up there? Sorry, my screen's like literally blank now. So blogs and social media, all of these are places where the community exists in some form or another. And participating in those places, asking questions, answering questions that you know, answering questions that you don't know, but you remember you saw somebody else ask. And you could say, oh, well, you're asking about the highlighter. I don't actually personally use the highlighter, but I remember somebody else asked about that, and here was a link to a blog post, or here was a link to some documentation that seemed helpful. Just sharing that information, sharing things that you've picked up by osmosis with other people who have similar situations. That kind of Q&A can be profoundly helpful, but it also helps you learn, right? You're studying the questions people ask, even if it's not your personal use case. That's growing your knowledge of the project and what it's capable of, even if you don't see it on your day-to-day. But you're also seeing the problems people have. You're learning, like, maybe that feature isn't as stable as I thought it was. Maybe I shouldn't go use it because I keep seeing people ask questions about why the fuck doesn't it work. But also, it's not just about the Q&A. It's also about sort of the shared experience, discussing what does and doesn't work for you, or what works well for you, or what you've done can help other people say, oh, wow, like maybe there's a gap there. Or maybe, sorry, voice is not happy. Maybe there's a lot of potential here that I didn't realize. Or maybe there's a lot of potential here that the community as a whole doesn't realize, but you're using it in an interesting way. And you want to share that because there's room for improvement there. But that sort of shared experience is really key. I want to sort of give an example here. Oh, yeah, okay, that does, wow. Yeah, all right, that looks good. Yeah, no, that's how it's supposed to look. Sort of you can imagine somebody comes along one day and posts to the user list or, something like, really sucks that, we'll say the highlighter. We'll say it really sucks that, like, the highlighter is just so broken. And, and you can be like, what are you fucking talking about? I use the highlighter every day. Like, I use the highlighter all the time. It works great. Like, what's your problem? Just that exchange, right? Just those top 2 lines. That might be enough to make this guy rethink everything he thought he knew, right? Maybe he just didn't dive in enough. Maybe he only spent 5 minutes on it, or maybe he inherited a project from somebody who didn't know what the fuck they were doing, and now he's got this preconceived notion that something is terrible. And just, being there and participating and saying, like, here's my experience, and my experience, it works great. That can help people question things and look at things and reevaluate and go read documentation. But the more you talk about it, right, the more you say, like, yeah, when I do it, this is how it's configured, this is what I do, this is how I use it, these are what my field types are. That might spur more conversation, right? You convince someone to share more about what they're doing and why it seems like it works or seems like it doesn't work. And then you can start a dialogue and you can say, well, they say, like, I try it with my whatever triangle means, I don't know, my Arabic text. And you'd be like, well, I don't use a lot of Arabic text, but I did an experiment. I tried it with Arabic text. It also seemed like it worked okay. Here is the specifics, right, of what I did. But what I didn't try is I didn't try it with a bigger corpus, or I didn't try it with other field types. I didn't try it configuring Arabic synonyms. Ask those questions, talk to those people. Maybe there's a bug. Maybe having that dialogue and that exchange helps us find that bug, right? You don't have to understand the code, but if you've got 5 minutes and somebody says something doesn't work, talking them through it might help. And maybe they figure out that they just completely don't understand how field types work, right? They didn't know there was a difference between the Arabic normalizer and the Unicode standard normalizer. You might help them, and they might help you later, right? Or you might help them figure out there's a bug that the 2 of you can now report. Even if you don't know how to fix it, you might be able to warn other people to, save them time down the road. That kind of shared experience, again, even without being a developer, even without knowing how it works under the covers, that can be huge. Wow, that's really bad. I'm gonna not cough into the microphone again. It's very easy to. That's green, by the way. These colors are way more washed out up here than I really expected them to be. It's very easy. I encounter a lot of people who assume that I know something better than they do because I wrote it. That is the great fallacy of our time, to think that the developer who wrote a piece of functionality understands it better than the people who use it every day. Because as a developer, I might have thought I knew what I was doing, and I might have written it to work a certain way, but that doesn't mean that I thought through every possible use case. It doesn't mean that I knew how you were going to use it tomorrow or the next day or the day after that, or that I really thought about every possible way you might use it. The developer might know a lot about how that feature works under the covers, but you might have a lot of experience with it at the surface layer and at interactions that I haven't thought about, and your experience can overlap with some other user's experience more than mine. So just because, you think, I don't know everything about how a feature works, doesn't mean that you don't have more overlap in this shared experience with a new user who comes along and asks a question about than I do, particularly when you start talking about how features interact. Yeah, that's almost readable. The developer who wrote feature X may have never thought about how it interacts with something else, right? They may not have ever even, there may be huge bugs when you try to use these two features in common that no one ever considered. And you may see that, and you may think, oh, I'm doing something wrong. No, not necessarily. Especially if other users are coming along and saying, hey, wait, how does this work? I don't understand. That shared experience, that dialogue, that exchange, the tips and tricks, finding ways to advise each other, to help each other, to say, maybe we should, think about how these features should interact better, having that conversation about what could be done better or what does or doesn't work well. That's huge because it's very easy for developers to get heads down and focused on what they're doing and to have a particular use case in mind and not see the forest for those trees, right? So again, this is all about the community involvement, and I'm hoping that the main takeaway you get here is that community involvement, even without writing a single line of code, but having lots of people do it. Right, having lots of people discuss and share and contribute their thoughts, their opinions, their experiences is more important than having 5 developers, just hammering away on features. That said, community involvement is very ephemeral, right? When you're on the mailing list, when you're in the comments, when you're posting something, that's a lot of exchange. That's really great. The next step is to really organize those experiences and organize those thoughts about how things interact and what works and what doesn't work into good documentation. Solr has documentation today that is, user-level documentation today that is so much better than what we had even 2, 3, 4 years ago. We've exponentially improved the documentation, in my opinion. What are we up to? 1,700 pages is when it's published as a PDF, something? 1,275. Thank you. Sorry. Oh, 1,300 a day? Okay, so it was 1,275 last week, 1,300 a day, when it's all bundled up as a book, basically. And that documentation, the value of that documentation really comes from the sort of the community, the shared experience. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Docs are important. We good? Cool, okay. That value of that documentation, it really comes from the many eyes. The sweet spot of documentation is that it can't just be accurate, it can't just be comprehensive, it also has to be useful, right? It has to be current, it has to be relevant. You really want to be in the center of these badly washed out colored circles. Developers, when they sit down and they, write a chunk of code or they add a feature to Solr, it's very easy for them to sit down and say, okay, and now I'm going to go write the Solr reference guide doc. I'm going to write a page about this new feature I added in the Solr reference guide. It's got 5 options, and they're all numbers, and this is what they're called. That's very accurate documentation, but that doesn't make it useful. That doesn't help you understand, how does this work, or when would I want this, or why would I want this, or how does it interact with these other things. Having that sort of comprehensive documentation, how does this work with some other feature? The developer who wrote it isn't necessarily in the best place to do that. Right? They're not necessarily thinking every possible way this feature could be used. They might sit down and write the good, basic guide to it, how does it function? But why do you want to use it? What are the use cases that this feature could be helpful for? The more users we have with their experiences coming along and saying, I really feel like this doc would be improved by a paragraph that describes the power of using this feature to implement XYZ, that's helpful. But also currency? What's the word I want here? Timeliness? I don't know. Making sure the docs are current. That's really hard when it's 1,300 pages of documentation, especially when features interact in weird ways. We might write documentation about a piece of functionality, and add it to a section of the doc that seems like it makes sense, but not realize that there's a completely separate section of the documentation that we might want to update to reference this new functionality. You know, adding new search options, you might think, great, we add that to the search section, but we might not realize that there's a whole section on, you know, use cases with time series data that could really be benefited by a, you know, quick paragraph there. The more people in the community who are reviewing the docs and reading the docs and sharing their experiences with, actually this piece of functionality like really should be documented over here. That can help make those docs, that entry level, you know, the entrance point to our project better for everyone. Particularly when we talk about the introduction, right? When we talk about new users' experiences with the project or new users' experiences with a piece of functionality, something that I find really frustrating about software is that the people who have the most experience are usually the worst people to explain it to someone who has no experience, right? You know, if you imagine I'm that, what are we gonna call that, red, orange? If you imagine I'm that big seasoned developer circle over there, I am very out of touch with what it means to be a new user to Solr, right? A new user to Solr who comes along today, I have no concept of what that's like. I've been doing this for like 15 fucking years. Like, I don't know what it means to have no frame of reference for what a search is, or what faceting is, or how to get started with Solr. You know, we have startup scripts now that I saw them get created into being, but the day one experience of sitting down and that being your entry point to Solr, I mean, sure, they make sense to me, but I saw them grow over 5 years, right? The people who are novice users, the people who are recently have started using Solr and just like, oh yeah, I get this, I sort of understand how this works. Those users are in the best place to help us say, are our entry-level documents like actually productive? Like, did this help you? Like, did you sit down and read our tutorial and think, okay, I get this, this makes sense. Step 1, step 2, step 3, yes, now I understand how Solr works. Because I could read it and say like, yeah, sure, that probably makes sense, but that doesn't mean anything because I knew all that information before I sat down and read it. The new users, the people who can really help them, the people who can contribute the most to documentation targeted towards new users are the people who are recently new users, right? The people who don't have preconceived notions of how all this stuff works. So chiming in and saying like, I really feel like maybe this tutorial would be better if you started here. When a new user comes along and says it, or a novice user comes along and says that, somebody whose name I don't recognize, I care way more about that than when somebody I've worked with for 15 years is like, maybe the tutorial should start like over here. I'm like, no, I don't believe you because you have no frame of reference. So what do you do if you want to help? What do you do if you want to help with the docs? Like I said, step 1 is, you know, the sort of read, review, critique, right? Help us figure out where the docs don't make sense, particularly the introductory material, but just in general. If you want to learn about a piece of functionality that really interests you and you go read the docs and they don't make sense, tell us that. Be like, hey, you know, I had no experience with, you know, I'm a Solr user, I've been using Solr for a year or two, but I had no experience with auto-scaling until today, and I wanted to learn about auto-scaling, so I went and read the section, and here's all the things that I just blew my mind. It didn't make sense to me. I like didn't understand the terminology at all. But also, if you did eventually get it, right? If you muddled your way through it and eventually understood, like, oh, okay, I kind of see what was intended here. Help us with that. Tell us, you know, this would have worked better. Examples. You know, if you found examples in the documentation that you tried out and you felt like they were confusing and there were better examples, tell us that, right? Say like, here would have been a really great example in the doc. Once I finally got it, once I went and like experimented and banged on it like a monkey, I sort of finally figured out like that this was sort of the simplest way to use it, but that's not in the doc. Like, we'll add it to the doc. Like, that'd be amazing. Like, to have a quick and simple example for everything would be awesome. So suggesting that alternative, helping us sort of think about like what's the best way to sort of explain this functionality. Particularly that's sort of the existing docs, but also if you're paying attention to features as they're being developed, right? Suggesting like, okay, well, this feature sounds really cool, but how are you going to document it, right? How are you going to explain this to new users? Because the guy who's writing the feature, he might be so in his own head about his own use case and his own plans for it that, you know, he might think like, yeah, I'm going to write a list of everything you do to do what I plan on doing with it. But if you're coming at it and you're seeing that guy sort of describe his new feature, he's working on it in Jira, he's proposing it, he's getting ready to write his patch, you can say, well, hold on, let's explain it this way, because this is sort of the generalization of your use case. That might make somebody completely rethink what that, you know, UI looks like before it's solidified, before it's hard-coded. As to how you do that contribution, that could be as simple as replying to emails or posting in our bug tracker in our Jira when you see people talking about something like, hey, what about this paragraph? You don't have to know a lot about our formatting or our build system. You can just be like, hey, what about changing this paragraph to this paragraph? Or if you're ready, if you feel comfortable, you could submit a documentation patch. And here's where we will get into the, what the fuck is that? Okay, yeah, sure, that's supposed to be a screaming emoji that had his head blown off by a shotgun, apparently. I don't understand our projectors. Okay, this is the one technical slide I'm going to have. Basically, this is just, you know, for people who don't write software, who have never built Solr from source before. I put this in here just as a quick, this is the bare bones thing that you need, right? At a minimum, if you wanted to really contribute to the docs or you wanted to get started, there's a lot more you could learn about how to build Solr and how to contribute patches and things like that. But if you wanted to go beyond the replying to an email with a paragraph of text saying, I think it would be great if you did this, if you actually want to help sort of give us the patch that we can apply and just build it as is, these three boxes sort of show you kind of the main things that you need to know about. The first box is just you need to install Java, Ant, and Git on your box. This is if it were a Debian system, if it were a Mac or a Windows box, God help you, I don't know what you do. You do that once. The second box is also something you do exactly one time, and that's to just sort of get a repo going on your local machine. You run those two commands exactly one time. It sort of gets you bootstrapped, gets you going. The last box is pretty much the cheat sheet that you kind of need to remember from then on. The first line is, hey, today I'm going to work on some Solr stuff. Let's get a super clean, let's like make my machine look like everybody else's machine. Then this sort of third line here is how you could sort of say, let's build the docs, or let's build an installation of Solr that I could like play with and run, just like if I downloaded it from the official mirrors. And these sort of second and fourth lines are kind of in between. If you wanted to try out someone's patch, if you wanted to experiment with something, you could apply it before you built. Or if you wanted to make some changes to the documentation, to Solr error messages, something like that, with the plan on contributing those back, once you built it, once you made your changes, tried it out, that's how you would generate a patch to share with the rest of the world. Okay? Is that super fucking scary for anybody, or are we all on board? Is there anybody that please, absolutely, this is designed for people who this slide should be scary. Is there anybody who still doesn't understand this? Is there anybody who didn't understand this before I put it up? Man, this audience is not who I thought was going to be in the room. Oh, wait, you? You didn't understand this before I put it up? You didn't. You didn't understand it. Awesome. What's your name? Tom? Thank you for coming, Tom. You're the one guy in this room who I was hoping would be in this room. All these other guys, I've seen most of them before. But you're good with this, right? So like in terms of, you know, even without like being a software developer, knowing much about how to build Solr, this helps you understand, like, if you wanted to really make a change in Solr and contribute it, these are the commands you need? Okay, good. I've reached Tom. That's what matters to me at this point. Okay, so we're done with the technical talk, so let's go back to the high-level community stuff. Yeah, okay, that looks right. So I brought up patches. I brought up Jira. You know, the community aspect, commenting in the community on the documentation, sharing your thoughts on how the documentation can be improved, that's all great. The next step, as we said, is sort of working with patches, working with Jira. Jira is our primarily, it's for bug reports, but it's also for features and improvements. It's kind of the next evolution in community involvement. Once you go beyond the user list and you really want to start paying attention to what developers are doing, you really have to start reading the dev list where all of the Jira issues send messages. But bug reports are also going to come in from users with if something's not working. Pause for effect. So when a bug report comes in, a way to help, a way to contribute to that bug report, even if you don't know anything about the code underneath, is to ask questions about it, right? Try to reproduce it. If somebody says that, what was my example before? The highlighter doesn't work with Arabic text, you can ask questions like, what exactly did you try? What does your schema look like? What does your configs look like? What was the request? Can you give me some sample data? A lot of the times we get bug reports that don't have that information. And you can help and save time for the community as a whole if you're the one that jumps in and says, I can't reproduce this. Can you give me more information to help me? Or maybe you could say, I can reproduce this. I do see the exact same problem. Because then we know it wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just one guy who tried something weird and didn't fully explain it. You can say, no, here are a simple itemized list of things you can do to see this problem. Because now a developer doesn't have to spend a lot of time wondering, like, how hard is this going to be? Do I go stand it up? It's like, oh, no, I can see it. Like 3 different people said, here are 5 simple steps, a simple recipe to reproduce this bug. Or maybe you can say, go one step further, like these 5 steps reproduce the bug, but if I change step 2, the bug goes away, right? Because now you've helped diagnose it. Even if you don't understand why there's a difference between step 2 in the case where it works and the case where it doesn't, that may be enough information that a developer can say, I know almost nothing about this code, but that gives me the tip, right? Anshin might be like, oh, wait. Really? If you change this one option, I think I know it, that somebody recently changed something that has to do with that option. I bet that's where that bug came from, right? That helps us save time, right? That helps other developers dive in and figure out sort of where those bugs exist. The other things you can do is, maybe the bug isn't that simple. Maybe it's going to take some time. But pointing out where you've seen similar reports, right? Just like when we talked about, participating in the user community, pointing out like, oh, other people had similar problems, asked similar questions, finding where similar bugs are been reported in different features or in different use cases can also help sort of narrow down like, oh, maybe these are related. What else I got? Oh, and then finally, patches, right? Eventually, someone's going to work on a bug and say, okay, well, I didn't fully understand the bug report, but here's a patch that I think fixes the problem. You can help test out that patch, right? You could go apply the patch that somebody posted Jira, and even if it wasn't your bug, even if it doesn't personally affect you, if you understood it, right? If that guy who originally reported it never came back again and was like, fucking highlighter, Arabic, I don't know, peace out. You could say, well, I was at least able to reproduce the problem he had, and I went and applied the patch, and I confirmed that the patch fixes the problem. But you could also say, and not only did I test that the patch fixed the problem, I can confirm that it didn't break anything else, right? I used the highlighter with a lot of other languages, and this patch that fixed Arabic didn't break any of the languages I work with every day. That improves that confidence in the patch, right? That improves that, trust that the community as a whole has that this is ready to go. Even if the developer who worked on it is like, well, based on the report, like maybe this is the right fix, but I'm not really sure. Nobody really wants to commit that until we're sure, right? Nobody wants to commit that until other people have chimed in and said, this is good. The real question to always ask, though, when you're looking at these bug reports is, what other information would be helpful, right? If you're looking at it and you have questions, other people have the same questions. So asking those questions or posting the answers to those questions can help save everybody's time the next time somebody goes and finds that bug report, right? But like I said, it's not just about bug reports. Feature proposals, features requests. If someone comes along and says, I think it'd be great if Solr had an option to be upside down. I don't know what that would mean, but that's a great question, right? You could go into that feature request and say like, well, what are you talking about? Like, what's your use case? What do you really mean by that? Like, what is the objective of having a function or a feature where Solr is upside down? Like, can you talk us through like your use case and your goal here? And if there is a, sort of elaboration, if there's a proposal, if somebody starts posting a patch that says, here's my patch that makes Solr upside down and backwards. You can talk through it and say, well, I tried out your patch. It's interesting. Maybe we should think more holistically. Maybe instead of a simple true, false, upside down or not, maybe it should be a numeric rotational value, right? Maybe we could generalize this. Maybe if you have a use case where everything is upside down and backwards, other people have a use case where it's slightly to the left or slightly to the right. Think about sort of how that proposal could be generalized, could be more applicable to lots of people. And again, test out the patch. Make sure it doesn't break anything for you. You could say it's noble that you want, that's a bad choice of words. You could say it's interesting that you want, Solr to be upside down and backwards, but when I applied your patch to make Solr upside down and backwards, it stopped being able to search documents, which seems kind of important to other people, so maybe we shouldn't commit it like this. Maybe we should rethink this functionality. Again, sort of think about as a user with some time who wants to help contribute to this project, what things should be discussed about this feature proposal to make it easier for for the other contributors and the other project maintainers to evaluate it and say, yeah, no, this looks good. Like, this functionality would be helpful. I mentioned thinking holistically. I love this quote. Francois Chalet, I don't know this guy. He's apparently pretty prolific in terms of writing about good software practices. Sorry. But he did a really great one recently about, I think it was called Notes to Myself on Software Engineering. And he really nailed it because his point was that, code always has a cost, right? Functionality has a cost. It's not just about what it takes to write a piece of code and add it to your project. It's not just about the cost of maintaining that code. It's also about the cost to your, the weight of having that code in your code base and what it means to every other line of code you ever want to add after that, right? And having to think about how all those features interact, having to think about how those options work with other things, having to give that, burden to all your users to now know that that functionality exists and have to think about when they use there's a lot of cost involved in everything you do with a project, particularly an open source project. And as project maintainers, we have to think about all those things too. So even if a feature comes along and it's ready to go and it's super simple, we have to think about, but is it so simple that we want to think bigger? We want to generalize it. We want to make it more applicable and more useful to other people. Is there a maintenance headache here? Is there a documentation headache here? Is there a confusion for the user that based on what it's named, people might think it does something it doesn't do, and we're going to get constant questions about it. This is what I mean when I talk about thinking holistically and thinking like a committer, right? Is, someone might come along and it might seem like a very straightforward, very simple proposal or a very simple patch, and it's ready to go, but we have to think broader in terms of, sure, this solves this one person's use case. Does that really mean it should be in Solr? Like, will it help anyone else, or will it just confuse other people to be there? Thinking about those questions as you're reviewing the issues can help save other people time to ask those questions as well, right? Even if you don't understand the code, you can still say, this seems interesting, but why are we making Solr upside down and backwards? Like, is that really in the best interest of the project? Because eventually someone's got to ask that question, right? Okay, I feel like I'm rambling now. Does everybody else feel like I'm rambling? Show of hands, rambling? Excellent. I appreciate your honesty, and I knew there was a reason I liked you. Okay, so submitting your first patch. If you're a software developer, this may feel like no-brainer, like I'm just going to dive right in, I'm going to write a patch, no big deal. What you really care about is all the stuff on that wiki page I mentioned, the specific ins and outs of the project and what guidelines we have. But at a higher level, when you want to really move past just the I'm helping out on the community, I'm helping out in the bug tracker, when you want to get started in the code base but you're feeling very hesitant or self-conscious or doubting your own skills, which is a thing I hear a lot, and I applaud that because it's the overconfident people who break things. When you want to get started and you want to start small, step one is documentation, right? Helping with the documentation, as I said, is a great way for people who are new to the project or who don't feel like they're experts on a project to really get started. So our documentation is part of our code base, and it's a great way to sort of get started with the code base, to just dabble by saying, okay, I'm gonna start with a patch to improve the documentation, to add some examples, to add some clarifying text, to reorganize some paragraphs in a way I think makes the most sense. That not only gives you a chance to help improve the documentation, it gives you a chance to get used to building Solr from source, building documentation, things like that. When you want to sort of dive in a little deeper, error messages. It is very hard to break Solr by changing an error message, but error messages are another aspect of the project that, as developers, we might think the error message is completely self-explanatory. As a new user of Solr who does something unexpected and gets an error message that's completely obtuse to you and refers to concepts you've never heard of, that can be a deal breaker. That can end it. Andy Lester, actually, I just saw a tweet like on Tuesday. He had a piece of code, nothing to do with Solr, but he posted a great example of someone who came along and was like, this error message, is, as a person who was on day one encountered this error message, it made no sense. Just changing a few verbs or like, adding a quick clarification that something wasn't meant as like a proper noun. I don't remember the specific example. I saw another great one though today, the data import handler. Anybody familiar with that, data import handler? Data import handler is like a feature of Solr that helps you index things out of data stores. It's been around a long time, has an XML-based configuration file. It has an error message that refers to root, and it refers to the root node of the XML file. Somebody saw that and thought they meant the problem was that they were running Solr as root, right? Like that's an example of where the error message is just bad, and it's been 20 freaking years, I think, that's too long. Let's go 12. It's been like 12 years. No one's ever thought, like, this is a bad error message. But anyway, fixing an error message, that's code, right? That's a string in the code. And finding that and suggesting, hey, maybe we should reword this error message. That's a great next step past documentation, right? Code comments. These are things that you're not likely to break the project by diving in here, right? But it's a great way to sort of get yourself comfortable with building Solr, making changes, making improvements that actually have real impact on people. Even if you're sort of self-conscious and worried about like what can you break. And then the next sort of thing would be tests. Writing more tests, we can never not have enough tests. And tests, again, even if you write a bad test, that just annoys other developers. No one's gonna be like, well, fucking Slack's down today because somebody wrote a bad test for Solr. If you write bad code for Solr, they might, but writing good tests helps you make sure that you understand the code, right? If you're trying to get ready to say like, I really want to add new functionality to the highlighter and I have a great idea for it, but I'm not sure I understand all of these code paths in the highlighter, I'm going to write a new test for that because that helps you prove to yourself that you understand how it currently works before you go change it. Or that helps you prove to everybody else that it's broken because you wrote a test that proves that it doesn't work the way the documentation says it does. So here's a test. Either we add to the documentation, or we change the documentation, or we fix the code. That's all a good step. And then once you've sort of worked your way through this, hopefully you're confident enough that you can be like, yes, like let's go fix some bugs, let's go add some features. And if you're not, iterate, right? Keep writing tests, keep working on the, keep contributing in that way, but be comfortable, right? Work your way up, feel comfortable as a contributor. I don't even know where I'm going with this. Oh, yeah, right. We'll get to that in a second. What time is it? Yeah, sorry. I have to wrap things up. But the point is, you can work your way up. You can start small. You can start with documentation, comments, etc., and still grow as a developer and as a contributor. Okay. I do want to. So the end sort of here is, think about what things you would want to see in a patch, right? Just like we talked about when you're reviewing the Jira, what questions you have, because other people have those questions. When you're reviewing your patches and thinking about your own contributions, ask those questions of yourself. But I do want to point out something that we call Yannick's law of half-baked patches, which is don't doubt yourself so much that you never contribute, right? A patch is just a patch. It doesn't have to mean anything. It doesn't have to ever go anywhere. But it's still better to be out there. It's still better to post it. It's still better to talk about it because then maybe other people can help you with it, right? You don't have to feel like you can't share your ideas or you can't share your contributions or you can't share your documentation edits until they're perfect. Perfect is the enemy, or what is it? Enemy of perfection? I don't know. I don't know the phrase and it doesn't fucking matter, but you get the idea, right? That's the whole point, is that you don't have to say, I'm going to keep my mouth shut unless it's perfect. You can go ahead and say, here's a patch. It kind of works sometimes. I don't really understand it, but that's at least the starting point, right? That's the start of that dialogue. In general, ask questions, both on the list and here today, because that's all I've got. Sorry, that meant I'm literally like, anybody have any questions? Yes? Oh, okay.
What's the community like and how does it?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah, sorry. So for people who didn't hear, the question was about sort of my thoughts on the state of the community, and as an example, Linus Torvalds in the Linux community and him being an asshole for a long time. The quick answer is there have been assholes in the Solr Lucene community for a long time, but they are not benevolent dictators for life or whatever Linus thought he was. The ASF as a foundation, as a nonprofit, is in charge, and there are ASF projects where bad actors became in charge of a project, and the ASF said, you're gone, and they started over from scratch, and the project kept going, right? It didn't matter that there was a couple assholes who got into power. You know, it's not a dictator for life situation where it's like, nope, you have to wait for them to literally realize their own failings and step aside. If you feel like somebody in the Lucene Solr community is being an asshole, there's a PMC you can take that to. And if you feel like the PMC isn't respecting or hearing the community's wishes to deal with that asshole, you can take it to the ASF board, and they'll just wipe the whole committee off the planet. Like, it's fine. Like, they have no compunctions about that. Because the foundation cares the most about the community, right? So I think the community as a whole is generally pretty helpful and engaging. The one problem that we do hear a lot is that people don't get a lot of feedback. But that's where, again, more people in the community can help. A lot of developers are very busy, just like everybody else on the planet, but a lot of people assume only developers can help them, right? And that's the catch-22, is that the way to get more developers is for more people in the community to collaborate and talk and grow and become contributors and committers who then have more time as an aggregate, even if individuals don't, right? But I think it's very open. We are technically out of time. I don't think anybody's in this room right after me, though, right? Yeah, so I'll stand here for a little while longer, as long as the nice ladies in the back of the room don't yell at me and take away my microphone. Yeah.
Are there enough committers? And if not, what can be done to make more committers?
That's a great question. So I'm going to repeat it. Are there enough committers? And if not, how do we make more? I don't know that the first question has a good answer, because if you go look at the list of committers, there's like 50 of them. The real problem is active committers, right? The real problem is people are actively committing stuff. Are there enough? I think that's subjective. I personally don't think so. I don't think there's enough active committers. But the other problem is, are they active in the ways they should be active? And again, that's a value judgment. I don't want to tell some committer, like, you're active, but you're not actively helping other people. You're actively working on your own shit. Because it's not my place to tell someone how they should spend their time. Just like I don't want anyone telling me, other than the nice lady in the back of the room who's my boss, how I should be spending my time. Take a bow, Cassandra, take a bow. So it would be great if there were more committers spending more time reviewing more patches, but it's also, as someone who's in that situation, it is hard. There's an emotional toll, right? To get emotionally invested in trying to shepherd something, and that trade-off between how much help do I give and how much time can I spare to try and make this something that feels ready to go into Solr and commit it, versus how much time are other people contributing, right? There's thousands of people using Solr. It can be very soul-crushing to try and take on that burden of being the person or the persons, who feel the responsibility to get everything committed. Because as I said, we have to think holistically and think about that cost, right? We have to think about, like, is this really in the benefit of the whole community right now? And there may be patches that are. Like, I'm not questioning that, but it's hard to find those, right? If we have a couple hours here and there to go digging in and looking, it's the ones where lots of people in the community have collaborated and teamed up and said, like, there's already been a discussion about the fact that this would make a good API, right? Before we even dive in and, like, burn a whole day discussing, like, maybe it doesn't make sense for Solr to turn itself upside down and backwards. That other people have chimed in, and multiple people from multiple backgrounds have said, I see a use case here, I see a use case here, I helped write up example docs, things like that. The more we get like that, the easier it is for a committer to say, great. The second part of your question, though, is how do we get more committers? And that's to see more people in the community who chime in and say, why does Solr need to go upside down and backwards? Here's an example. The more people, Doug Cutting, who started Lucene Project, again, like 20 years ago, he had a great example of, when asked, like, what's the qualification to be a committer, his answer was, when I'm annoyed at having to commit your stuff for you, right? His point was, like, if he goes in Jira every day and it's like, why isn't this? Oh, right, I have to commit that. Like it's ready to go. I don't have to do anything. Like they've already thought through all the problems. They've already had the discussions. They've already talked about it, and it's just ready to go. And it's just more time out of my day to actually sit down and run the commit command. That's when he felt people were ready to be committers. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Oh, wait. I think you were first, right? I don't know. You guys sat next to each other. One of you should know who was first. Okay.
How do we have a conversation before patches go up about what features need to go in, what bug fixes need to go into near versions of Solr? So there's a lot of conversation around what features are missing, where do we want the thing to go. There are a lot of bugs.
There are.
And Solr is a production product for a lot of people. Production systems need bug fixes.
Yep.
And committers are very busy people. Committers don't have time to review patches. But people who aren't committers also, putting up a patch is also
Yes.
a amount of work. And there are a lot of patches that never go anywhere.
Correct.
They just sit out there. So how do we have the conversation about, hey, if somebody puts up a good patch for this, this can go in version 8. Okay, it has to wait till version 9 because it's risky. How do we have that conversation as a community?
Okay.
That's not.
Right. So to summarize for people who may not have heard and for the video, and I want you to nod or shake your head when I miss or overlap something. It's sort of a discussion about the importance of talking about bugs and talking about what versions bug fixes should go in and how to prioritize bug fixes and how to deal with patches that may be fixing bugs that languish and don't get attention. Did I miss anything? Okay. So no, I just want to make sure I'm like accurately capturing the like crux of the question. I don't have a panacea answer for that. I think as far as the sort of discussion of like what releases should bug fixes be in once they're ready, right? Let's start from that assumption, right? Let's start from the assumption that there is a bug and everybody knows it's a bug and there's a fix and everybody agrees the fix is good, right? Then the question of what releases it goes in is a community one. It's a discussion in the JIRA of this is important enough that we should do a 7.5.2 release, right? Or this is important enough, that we should try to backport it like that. But at the end of the day, someone has to be willing to put in the effort to be the release manager to create that release. There also has to be, like you say, the sort of back compatibility question of fixing this bug the right way could break things if we try to backport it any farther past, or if we try to commit it any sooner than 8 or any farther back than 7.6. And again, that's got to be a community question of the people who understand the risks and the trade-offs. And I don't always know the answer to that. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question of that is somebody has to volunteer to be a release manager to shepherd things through.
Yeah.
How does a committer has to volunteer to be the release manager, right? So
Not technically. Technically, anybody could volunteer to be a release manager. It's just really fucking hard if you're not a committer because of all the assumptions in the process about what you can and can't do personally. But yes, let's just assume for the sake of argument that they have to be a committer. Yeah.
so it's not just that someone has to step up to it, it's that you have to convince a committer
Yes.
that a bug is sufficiently
Yes.
done or whatever. So, but there's no visibility into which committers are going to be a release manager and
Oh, I mean,
like attacking GitHub, it's like, okay guys.
there may not feel like there's a lot of visibility, but that's all happening on the dev list when people are saying like, I feel like we should do a release, and other people are saying like, okay, I kind of have time, I'll do it. There's way more transparency than people think. People think that we like have a cabal of no. It's just there's not a lot of conversations happening. Honestly, like it's not that you're being locked out of conversations. It's that there aren't a lot of conversations happening. Usually, it's someone who says, and again, like you say, committers. Right? It is a totally valid point that it's almost impossible to, as a non-committer, say I feel like there should be a backported bug fix for this. Let's do it. But it's not like there's a list somewhere in secret of who's got time to do a release.
Yeah, but so that's the next question. Is it's buried down in the dev list. There's a lot of traffic on
There
dev
is.
list, right? And
Yes.
So there's a lot of traffic on the dev list.
There is. So the dev list in particular, for those who don't know, is 99% Jira, right? It's Jira automated messages. Anything else is super important. So filtering the Jira stuff into a folder and then looking at the other stuff, that's where people are like, I think we should probably do it really soon, things like that.
So that's how you figure out who's going to be doing it.
Yeah.
You filter out your Jira, all of the Jira messages.
Or you, or,
What about setting
or you just read them all.
a mailing list for the Jira and a mailing list for developers communication?
I'm fine with that, but there's been discussions around whether or not it's good to have a separate list. I don't know. But again, that's a discussion for the list, right? That's I know it's like a weird chicken and egg, right? Anyway, hold on. I want to go back. There was a second part of your question that I feel like we glossed over, which is, the first part was sort of identifying like what's important enough to be backported, and when it should be released. And again, that's really about having lots of voices requesting it in the issues and on the list and saying, I think there's enough here to warrant a 7.5.5 release or whatever, and here's why. These bugs are really bad and we should be backporting them and fixing them. There's a straw man argument to that though, which is we should roll forward, and I'm not going to take sides on that, but I just want to point that out. The second part of your question though was convincing people that bug fixes should be committed in the first place, and patches that may be fixing bugs that seem critical to people that languish. And I do want to revisit that because, without making too broad generalizations, frequently what happens is a bug fix fixes a bug in a way that is questionable, right? There's a lot of bug fixes that I look at and I say, I see that this bug is very bad for a subset of users, and I see that this fix fixes a subset of that subset, but I don't understand it enough to be confident that it doesn't break things for other people who haven't faced this bug. And so there's a trade-off and a weighted choice made there about the damage of the bug as it exists versus the risk of the fix that you're not confident in. And that's where I go back to the more people who in the community participate and test out patches and say, this works well and it didn't break anything else for me, is huge. This is where I'm going to like go off the rails a little bit and say, a long time ago I felt like there was a lot more collaboration in general in Jira. I feel like if you went and looked at the number of voices in a particular Jira issue 5 years ago, you would see a much higher average number per Jira than today. I feel like today you see one person create a Jira, post 4 comments, and then one person says, looks good, and then it's done. I wish we had more people saying, this bug affects me. This bug affects me, this is how it affects me. I tried out the patch, and the patch fixed my use case and didn't break anything else for me. Because that would be the kind of data point that would help us say, even though I don't really understand the bug, and even though I don't really understand the fix, I feel confident that the people who worked on this and talked about it do, and that we should just commit it, right? Even if I don't fully get it, I feel like we should move forward and commit this. Does that make sense? Does that answer that second part of your question? It's not the answer you want, but I want to thank you all for coming. For those of you who want to leave, don't feel like you have to stick around, by the way. At some point, they're going to take my mic away, and it's just going to be a conversation in the hallway. So if you're like, we were done like 10 minutes ago.